So let's remind us where we are. On Monday we spoke about Exodus chapter 12 and the biblical requirements for the Paschal Lamb. We tried to unpack some of that. And I ended with the notion of a Seder. So I'm going to pick up exactly where I left off. So here's my definition of a Seder, which is exactly the same as what was on the handout for Monday's lecture. And my big point was that in Exodus chapter 12 and other passages, we do see an educational function of the Paschal ritual, in which if your child asks you X, then you should say Y, and the whole series of such passages. I'm not quite sure what that would have meant in its original context or how this was meant to have been performed. And it is out of these passages that a Seder will later on emerge, but I don't think the biblical text is yet aware of what will come to be called a Seder. All right, that was my point. Feel free to disagree, but that's what I would argue. So let's discuss again what a Seder is. That's what we're going to be discussing today. What is the Passover Seder? And we'll look again briefly at how it compares to the biblical material and how it develops in rabbinic Judaism. So, Seder. The word Seder is just a normal Hebrew word which means order or arrangement. So, it is a meal eaten, right? It is done at the table, so it's done over a meal. So there's food involved. And there's a ritual. You don't just eat the food, there's a whole ritual attached to how it is eaten and the way in which it is eaten. Performed on the first night of Passover, 15th of Nisan. Remember that? So the 14th of Nisan at dusk turns into the 15th. What is Nisan? Did I use the word Nisan last time? I think I did. So why doesn't somebody ask me right away? What is Nisan? Nisan is the post-biblical name of the first month in the Hebrew Jewish calendar, in the spring. In the Hebrew Bible, the word Nisan does not appear. Okay? This is a post-biblical name for the first month, the spring month, what Exodus chapter 12 calls the first month. This comes to be called the month of Nisan. Okay? Not spelled the way the car maker, that is two S's, this is one S. So the 15th day of Nisan, right, so the 14th at dusk, then we have, this is when this ritual is performed. And it consists of symbolic food. What is symbolic food, class? I'll make it clear, the food is not symbolic, the food is real. But we're eating real food, not for its nutritive value, not for its piquant array of flavor. Rather, the food is eaten because it symbolizes something. It represents something. So, for instance, bitter herbs. Bitter herbs, right. We eat bitter herbs at the Seder because the bitter herbs remind us, symbolize, represent, recall to mind, right, the bitterness of the Israelites in Egypt in slavery. So the Mishnah, as we'll discuss in 1 second, has already symbolic food, and one can argue Scripture itself refers to bitter herbs, but Scripture itself does not explain why you'd want to eat the Paschal Lamb with the bitter herbs. But that again is the scriptural warrant for the idea that we have symbolic food, i.e. foods that represent something, foods that are not what they appear. It looks like I'm eating a piece of horseradish, but it's true, but the horseradish that I'm eating only because it reminds me, by eating it, it helps bring to mind the suffering, the bitterness of our ancestors in Egypt. Okay? Now, on the Passover Seder, there are a bunch of symbolic foods, and they will ultimately come to be arranged in what's called a Seder plate. And here is a lovely photo of a Seder plate. These people put a cup of wine in the middle, which is not required, but it looks nice on the photo. So here you have typically 6 little bowls, cups. It depends on how fancy you bought a Seder plate. You can get little plastic ones for 79 cents. And you can get one which is done by a fancy artist with gold gilt and inlay, and it depends what you want. This one looks like an in-between one. Anyway, back to the subject matter at hand. So here we have arranged on the Seder plate. We'll do a quick tour of what you have on the Seder plate, which is typically placed in the middle of the table, and it contains these symbolic foods. Some of them are eaten, and some of them are not eaten. We just look at them to remind us of various things. So here we have some green leafy things. Why do we have green leafy things? Because it's spring. We eat green leafy things. It's an hors d'oeuvre. I don't have a good explanation for that. So these people seem to use parsley. Right? In my family, we use celery. Some people use potato. Okay, so you have some green leafy things. Not very symbolic, except maybe it's spring. Here is salt water. Salt water representing the tears of the Israelite slaves. Here we have bitter herbs. This looks like ground up horseradish. Shouldn't use the kind from the jar, but okay. They use the kind from the jar. So you take horseradish. Why? Because horseradish is bitter. This was probably their charoset, which is mentioned in the Mishnah, which is a Roman-style dipping sauce. What is this symbolic of, you say? Well, the Mishnah does not explain, but every Hebrew school child knows that the charoset represents the mortar of the Israelites who are working with mortar and brick. So this represents the mortar. It's a Roman salad dressing. Right, and then we have two cooked foods. This is a shank bone over here, and this is a roast egg. We don't eat the shank bone, but we have the shank bone on the table to remind us of the Paschal sacrifice that our ancestors used to bring in the temple in Jerusalem. Then we have a roast egg. No one is quite sure why we have a roast egg. A lot of complicated explanations, which I won't go into, but we have two cooked foods on the Seder plate. One is the shank bone, which definitely represents the Paschal sacrifice, which we no longer have, so we just have a shank bone to remind us of that which we used to have. And then we have another roast food, an egg. All right, I also have on the webpage a different Seder plate. There you go, different views, slightly different arrangement of foods. Here, like me, they have celery in their family instead of the green parsley stuff. And here they have romaine lettuce, it looks like, over here. Here are the two cooked foods, shank bone, egg. Here is that charoset, Roman salad dressing. And this looks like also horseradish from a jar, except they have the red horseradish. Okay, if your family does it differently, fine. I'm not endorsing any custom here. I'm just describing what pictures I could find on the web. Okay, that's symbolic food. Do you understand what symbolic food means then? Okay. Keep this in mind, class, when we discuss the Eucharist next week. When Christians are eating bread that's not bread and drinking wine that's not wine. Okay? Okay, what did I just mumble? I mumbled some Aramaic incantation. Okay, so symbolic food, that's symbolic food. So we have symbolic foods that we eat. There are foods on the plate that we eat, and some foods we just look at because they remind us, they evoke, they represent something, okay? Then we also have real food. What is real food? A meal. Right, Passover Seders are famous for stuffing yourself, right? That's part of the experience of a Passover Seder. You can't finish until you ate my gefilte fish, right? Until you had various courses. Okay, so that's real food. Ritualized gestures. Ritualized gestures. Well, again, the whole series of different customs, the ritualized gestures. The simplest gesture is pointing, right? We pick up the matzah, the piece of matzah. We pick up the cup of wine at various moments in the proceedings. We point at the bitter herbs. Okay? If you belong to a Christian church where you're going to sanctify the host, in many churches they pick it up and show the congregation. That's a ritualized gesture. You pick up the wine, you pick up the host. Okay? That would be a ritualized gesture. Well, we have that at the Passover Seder. Ritualized speech. Parentheses, questions and answers, benedictions, praise, scripture, exegesis, narrative. Let's say we have a scripted text. Right, we're talking, but it's not a free-form talking. We have a script. We have a text in front of us that we follow and we say certain things as are prescribed for us. Right? These consist of questions and answers, which we'll see in a moment. Benedictions. What's a benediction? Blessings. Right? This is a 10-second digression. One very peculiar thing about Jewish theology is that we meaning we humans, bless God. Which of course is entirely counterintuitive. Because shouldn't be God blessing us, you ask. Well, maybe, except that in rabbinic liturgy, Jewish liturgy, we are blessing God. Blessed art thou, O Lord, or praise, perhaps you might say, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who X. So we bless God. Okay, just an interesting point. I don't have time to deal with that, but that's something very profound and interesting is going on there. But that's a standard feature of rabbinic liturgy. What does liturgy mean? Liturgy?
Prayers.
Yeah, standardized service, right? I guess the service of worship. Fancy word is liturgy. Why didn't you ask me when I use this word? Bums, all of you. Okay. Benedictions, praise. There's praise of God, and that's sort of understandable. Scriptural exegesis, but we know what that is. We've seen that. You quote scripture and you interpret it. And narrative, storytelling. Those are the different forms of the ritualized speech in the Seder. Okay, and the book that we use is called the Haggadah. That's the book you get, right? You can get it for free if you go to a big supermarket at Passover time. In the Passover section, they'll have stacks of Haggadahs. And again, or you can spend a lot of money to get an illustrated one. You know, I mean, there are scholarly ones, there are all kinds of things. Okay, that's the book. Okay, questions on these terms, just so we know what we're talking about. Haggadah, Seder, bitter herbs, wine, everybody understands what we're talking about, yes? Questions? Okay. Now I'm going to launch into my lecture, and the first word is Mishnah. And before I say anything else, somebody remind me what the Mishnah is. Yes, what's her name?
Brennan.
Brennan.
Yes.
Yes. Brennan, what's the Mishnah?
It's a rabbinic book from the 2nd century CE that deals with rituals and legalities and laws of...
Good, I'll take it. That's great. Right. Rabbinic, it's a book. It's a rabbinic book. I would add it in Hebrew from the 2nd century CE, dealing mostly with legal rituals, laws, customs, behaviors, and the like. Okay, we read a piece of Mishnah, you recall, about Shabbat in chapter 7, Mishnah Shabbat chapter 7, on the 39 prohibited labors. Right? That's a typical piece of Mishnah. A list of things you should not do. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Good, so it's around the same time as our friend Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is writing around what year? 160, give or take. The Mishnah presumably is taking shape around then because the book seems to emerge at the end of the 2nd century, around the year 200. So this seems to be taking shape around the same time. Okay? Good. That was a quick review. Good. All of you knew that, right? Just he had his hand raised first. But all of you could have answered that. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, moving along. So, the first time we see black on white, clearly, unambiguously, right? A Passover Seder is in the Mishnah, Tractate Psachim. Psachim means Passovers. Tractate Psachim, chapter 10. And right here on your handout, on your lecture handout, I have conveniently provided you Mishnah Psachim, chapter 10. Okay, but we don't have time to read through the whole thing and discuss the whole thing, so I'm going to focus on the big points. But here we have Mishnah Psachim chapter 10, and a text in the Mishnah, so let's say around the year 200 CE. I see very clearly, unambiguously, I don't have to say surely, because it's right here on the page, a Passover Seder. And let's look at the main features of the Passover Seder. So my lecture handout I have there's bullet points, which I'm focusing on these points. So I'm going to jump back and forth from the bullet points here to the text in the of Mishnah Psachim chapter 10. First bullet point, 4 cups of wine. Where do you see that in the Mishnah? The Mishnah tells you right away in the very first paragraph. Excuse me. Even the poorest in Israel must not eat till reclining on a sofa, and they, dispersers of charity, should give not less than 4 cups of wine. Even the poorest person in Israel needs to have 4 cups of wine, and the town fathers need to see to it that even the poorest people can get 4 cups of wine. For us historian types, we immediately are intrigued. Where do these 4 cups of wine come from? Where does wine come from? I know it comes from grapes, I know. But where does the requirement of wine come from? Does the Torah in Exodus chapter 12 mention wine in connection with the Paschal sacrifice? The answer is no. So Barr mentions this very briefly in the article. There's an interesting question. Where does the custom of wine come from? The obvious answer is because ancient Israel, Judea, later Palestina, right, is located in a wine belt. As you know, all the world cultures can be divided up into beer belt and wine belt. Right? So the great classical cultures, wine cultures, Italy is wine, Greece is wine, ancient Israel is wine. Okay? Beer, Egypt is beer. The Mesopotamian civilizations are beer. Right? The choice between growing grain or growing wine, growing grapes. Grapes goes with olives. Right? Those cultures seem to go together. So this is a country of viticulture. So I'm not surprised that they're drinking wine. Makes a lot of sense. However, we're not just drinking wine here. Presumably they drank wine every day. But here it's ritualized, as I said again. We're going to have 4 glasses of wine, and we're going to drink each glass at a specified moment in the proceedings. So where does that idea come from? What's the history of that? We don't know. It's hidden from us. Earlier text before the Mishnah mentioned drinking wine alongside the Paschal sacrifice, but these texts are all, again, from the late Second Temple period. I talked about Second Temple, take that back. Last century is BCE, earliest time we hear about it. By the time it gets to the Mishnah, it's ritualized. You drink wine at specific moments, and you drink 4 cups. We don't know where this comes from, but that's part of the Passover Seder, 4 cups of wine. Next bullet point, appetizers. We next eat some appetizers, going back to the Mishnah, right here. The Mishnah assumes you have attendants. So there's always they, mysterious, anonymous, third person, plural, are doing things for you. The Mishnah doesn't explain where these mysterious attendants come from, how much you have to pay them, who they are, and what if you don't have attendants, who does this work. Answer is usually the wife who does it. But okay, that's just a sociological aside. So here we have attendants, or mysterious servants who are doing things. So they fill the first cup of wine for him. Him is the householder who's running the show. Then the house of Shem and the house of Hillel debate the proceeding of blessings. The key point here is that the Seder begins as any fancy meal does in Judaism. It begins with a ritualized blessing over a cup of wine. We recite the blessing over a cup of wine at the beginning, before the food. Keep this in mind next week, please, when we talk about the Eucharist and the consecration of the bread and the wine. Right? What comes first? Answer, in this text, as in all rabbinic texts, we bless the wine first, and we eat the food afterwards. Even if the house of Shem and the house of Hillel disagree on the details of the liturgical details, which I will not concern us. Oops. Then the paragraph 3. They set the food before him. Here are the appetizers that I mentioned. We have lettuce. We have parperet of the bread. Mysterious word, no one is quite sure what it means. Condiment, course, question mark, not quite sure. So we have some kind of lettuce. We have some accompaniment of the bread. In this context class, what would bread mean?
Matzah.
Matzah, presumably, not Wonder Bread or some other leavened bread. This is the evening of the 14th into the 15th day of Nisan, the beginning of the 7-day Matzah festival, when you may not see any leaven in your house. Unquote from Exodus 12. So presumably it says the word bread, but it surely it means matzah. All right, so because matzah is a kind of bread. Remember that next week when we talk about the Last Supper and Jesus breaks bread. It's not bread, it's matzah. Okay, back to where we are. So, we have the parperet of the bread. Some bread condiment, presumably is something you smear on top of the bread or going with the matzah. We're not quite sure exactly what this means. Then we have here the next paragraph. They set before him unleavened bread. Here it says specifically matzah, lettuce, and the charoset. We saw the picture of the charoset on the Seder plate earlier. That's this Roman dipping sauce. And 2 cooked foods. Manuscripts omit 2 cooked foods. Okay, so the charoset is not compulsory. Rabbi Elazar says it is compulsory. Okay, a little confused here. Yeah, it's a little confused to know exactly what's going on. don't want to pursue the details. The key point here is we seem to have an appetizer course. Okay? And this again, here it is. Here's the appetizer course. Matzah, lettuce, charoset. What's charoset? It's some kind of compound of various ingredients. I said it's a Roman salad dressing, a Roman dipping sauce. You want my family's recipe? Talk to me afterwards. Right? Not a great recipe, but it's okay. Don't have time to deal with the details. There are different kinds of charoset out there. Each family has their own recipe. So, appetizer. Again, this is ritualized, though. This is not just a meal where we think we want to have appetizers. Gee, honey, what should we serve before the meat? Let's have appetizers. Sure, dear. Right. No, I'm not talking about that. This is ritualized. It's scripted. You got to have it. This is part of the evening. Why do we have this? Well, as Barr argues, just to jump ahead a bit, we have here a ritualized, scripted Roman meal. Because on this night, we Jews, we Israelites, we are Roman aristocrats. Hey, we're the 2nd century CE, right? That's what you want to be. You want to be honchos, machers, people who matter. So we pretend we're Roman aristocrats having a Roman meal. We're following the script of a Roman meal, but we're translating it into a Jewish context. Okay, those are these mysterious appetizers. Okay. After the appetizers, what comes? I'm going to skip this line. In the paragraph, in the temple, they would bring the body of the Passover sacrifice before him. Barr discusses correctly that this seems to be out of place, and the sequence here is a little screwed up. Not quite sure what to do with this. Interestingly enough, the Mishnah seems all of a sudden to wax antiquarian. That is to say, the Mishnah all of a sudden tells you, this is what we used to do. But one problem that bothers me a lot, the Mishnah Psachim, chapter 10, is not clear to me when you're supposed to eat the meal. I know we're eating a meal because we have a grace after meals at the end. Here. He then recites the grace after meals, paragraph 7, from which I deduce they're eating a meal. But when exactly are they eating a meal? The Mishnah nowhere tells me. And this line here, in the temple they would bring the body sacrifice before him, seems to be out of place. Okay, look at Barr who discusses this. Remind me again, class, and in the temple they used to bring the good old days, we brought the Passover sacrifice. In the time of the Mishnah, are they still bringing a Passover sacrifice? No, because the temple had been destroyed when? 70. So this is an antiquarian reference. In the old days, at this point, they would have brought the Paschal sacrifice. Okay, so what do we got so far? We have wine, we have the appetizers, various cooked foods and salad dressings, condiments, and whatnot, right? And then they fill the second cup because you drank the first cup, so you refill it, so it's ready to go. And now comes the scripted speech, right? The ritualized speech acts, I'm tempted to call it. Right, not some aimless chatter around the table, but rather we have a set of themes and a set of text that we will now recite. And to jump ahead a piece, this is what ultimately makes the Seder a Seder. It's not just the food, it's these speech acts that accompany the food. Okay, and here, or another translation might be rightly, instead of punctuating it v'chein instead of v'chan, the son questions his father. Or in modern gender-neutral translations, the child asks his parent. But I'm pretty sure the Mishnah means the son asks his father. Right? I'm pretty sure they were not politically correct yet in the year 200 CE. The son questions his father. If the son is unintelligent, his father instructs him how to ask. The father instructs him to ask, how is this night different from all other nights? For on all other nights we eat leavened and unleavened bread, whereas on this night we eat only unleavened bread. I'm using one traditional tune for this. This is the famous 4 questions. Here are the 4 bullet points. 1, 2, 3, 4. If you look at the thing very carefully, of course you notice that many manuscripts leave this one out, so therefore we only have 3 questions, 3 points, not 4. You notice too that if you're familiar with the Passover Manishtana liturgy questions, you read them as a kid, you will notice that the ones that we have are not the same as these. One of them is different. So you put them all together, you can wind up with 5. And it's not clear at all if these are 4 questions or 1 question with 4 answers. So there's all kinds of messy things. But this is not our problem. All these are interesting problems. But they're not the problem that really affects us in our class. We simply have a point. The father is supposed to instruct the son. And if the son doesn't know enough to ask, as the son is clueless what's going on, then the father needs to take the initiative and instruct him what's going on. Right? So these are the 4 questions or 4 topics for discussion. Right? Unleavened bread, bitter herbs, eating roast, stewed or boiled, on this night only roast, following Exodus chapter 12, which says that you roast the lamb, not Deuteronomy 16, which has a different verb and it's confusing, but in Exodus 12 we roast the lamb. Other nights we dip once, on this night we dip twice, because in this night we are Roman aristocrats, so we have multiple courses of dipping. So we have then ritualized question, ritualized instruction, and then this line, according to the son's intelligence, his father instructs him. Questions, anyone? You understand what I'm saying? This is ritualized speech, right? This is not free form. We have a script. Then comes a mysterious line. He, presumably the father who's instructing the son, he commences with shame and concludes with praise. Commences with shame and concludes with praise. Is that clear what that means? Yeah, I agree with you. It's not at all clear what that means. It's rather cryptic. I think the simplest way to understand that is to assume that this line leads into the next line, right? It's the header for the next line. Although I punctuated it as a separate line, which is how the Talmud understands it. But I think the simplest way to take it would be to say this line introduces, or is the first half of the sentence, which continues in the second half, and expounds from a wandering Aramean was my father until he completes the whole section. All right, what is that? Well, luckily, Professor Cohen put on his lecture notes the whole passage. So it's right here. So what is this passage? A wandering Aramean was my father. So here's this passage from Deuteronomy 26. And a lot of interesting things going on here too. Excuse me a moment. Fine. When you enter the land the Lord has given you as a heritage, when you possess it and settle it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil which you harvest in the land you bring, etc., etc. And you shall go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name. That is a periphrastic construction, which means you shall go to the temple. You shall go to the temple in Jerusalem. But the word Jerusalem never appears in the book of Deuteronomy. Instead, you have this mysterious circumlocution many times. The place that God will choose to establish his name. You shall go to the priest in charge and say to him, blah, 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 acknowledge this day. The priest shall take your basket from your hand, set it down in front of the altar of the Lord. You shall then recite as follows before the Lord. Everybody got the scene? You brought a basket of first fruits into the temple. You give it, the farmer, Israelite farmer, you give it to the priest accepts it, acknowledges it, and then you recite this. What do you say? You, Israelite farmer, what do you say? My father was a fugitive Aramean, different translation. My father was a wandering Aramean. Here's that passage to which the Mishnah of Sachem is referring. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. Then he became a great and very populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord, you are our fathers, and Lord heard our plea, so our plight to misery, our oppression. Lord, freed us from Egypt by mighty hand and outstretched arm and awesome power, by signs and portents, or signs and wonders. He brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Therefore I now bring the first fruits of soil to you, O Lord, which you have given to me. That's the passage. And I would argue this passage fulfills the mandate. We begin with shame and end with glory. We begin with shame. My father was a fugitive Aramean, a wandering Aramean, and it ends up with glory. Now, God, you've given me the land, and here I'm bringing you first fruits. Now, the interesting point, class, does this passage have anything to do with Passover? No, it's the first fruits festival. Is Passover a first fruits festival? It's too early in the season. It's early in the spring. They don't have first fruits yet. So the first fruits festival is whenever it is. But the sages, our rabbinic sages who give us the Seder, took this line from the first fruit declaration and transferred it to a centerpiece of instruction on the evening of Passover as part of the Seder. Why did they pick this paragraph to do so? Answer, I don't know and nobody knows. But the obvious suggestion would be, it's a very lovely one-paragraph, short capsule summary of Israelite sacred history, focusing on Israelites going to Egypt, getting enslaved, getting redeemed, and returning. That's the story. Here you have the whole story in 3 sentences. So it works educationally speaking, pedagogically speaking. It's a nice capsule summary of the sacred history of the Israelites and the story of Passover. That's the best I can do. If you like that explanation, great. If you don't like that explanation, or you're not entirely happy with it, then I got nothing better to offer. Then it's your turn. Okay, so here we have, if you look at our current Haggadahs, this is the part that most people skip. So the Haggadah gives this paragraph, and then takes apart each of these phrases, individual phrases, and discusses each of these phrases in a way that most people find completely baffling and bewildering. Right? So our current Haggadah takes this paragraph and then expands upon it. This is what I meant when I said we have scriptural exegesis. You quote the scripture and then explain it. The Mishnah just tells you this is what you're supposed to do. Then verse 5, paragraph 5, back to the Mishnah. Questions? Okay, so I'll keep going. Paragraph 5. Rabbi Gamliel used to say, whoever does not mention these 3 things on Passover does not fulfill his obligation. And these are they: the Passover sacrifice, unleavened bread, and bitter herb. Once again, ritualized speech. Right? You can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but you got to make sure you mention these 3 things, Rabbi Gamliel says. Otherwise, you don't fulfill your obligation. What obligation is that?
The obligation of teaching?
Apparently, that's the simplest way to take it. Apparently, Rabbi Gamliel means your obligation to teach your child, to teach your son. Right? You got to make sure when you're instructing your son that you hit these 3 topics. I'm not 100% sure that's what it means, but that's the simplest way to take it. That's how it's usually understood. So what are the big three themes? Passover sacrifice, the Hebrew word is Pesach, unleavened bread, matzah, and bitter herbs, maror. So here we have Passover sacrifice. Once upon a time that was real food. That's what you ate in the Passover Eve. Nowadays, by the time of Rabbi Gamliel, assuming this is the famous Rabbi Gamliel of the 2nd century, not the Rabbi Gamliel of the 1st century, right? For him already this is reminiscence of what we used to eat in the old days when we had a temple. Unleavened bread matzah, which of course we still eat on this eve, and bitter herbs, of course we eat that still. Then we have little brief lines explaining what these 3 are, and then that's these 3. Then we have this important line, which I'll come back to in a moment. In every generation, not clear if this is a continuation of the Gamliel statement. Apparently it's an independent statement. The Mishnah talking, kind of giving a liturgical conclusion. In every generation, one is bound to regard himself as if he personally had gone forth out of Egypt. Namely, you, the Jewish person who is doing this ritual, you are thereby transformed. You are not a poor Jewish farmer of the 2nd century CE. You, in fact, are now not even a Roman aristocrat, pretending Roman aristocrat of the 2nd century CE. You have become an Israelite liberated from slavery generations ago. Their experience is now yours. You are to regard yourself as if you personally had gone forth out of Egypt. So it's transformative, or it's meant to be transformative. Then we have a phrase phrase of praise. Whew, that's tough. Then we have a paragraph of praise of God over here for all of God's wondrous deeds. We recite some psalms, etc., etc., and then we argue about how to exactly conclude these psalms liturgically speaking, right? Then we skip to a third cup of wine. Then we have grace after meals. Hey, Mishnah, you forgot something. When do we eat? Which is the main question most children ask on Passover Eve, right? When do we eat? Mishnah, you skipped to the grace after meals, but where's the meal part? That's what I mentioned earlier. I'm not quite sure where the meal is in this context. I know traditionally nowadays, the post-Mishnaic custom is we eat the meal between paragraph 6 and paragraph 7. We finish these liturgical formula, recite some psalms, and then right here, in this gap, we eat the meal, paragraph 7, grace after meal. Okay, I just wish the Mishnah had said that. That would have been a little more reassuring. But okay, what can I do? I wasn't there, so they didn't ask my opinion. So here we have the third cup, grace after meals. That's a real meal, not a symbolic meal, real food with real dessert and everything else. Sorry, leave out dessert. Didn't say that. You have a real meal. Then you have the fourth cup. He concludes the Hallel, more psalms and hymns and so on. Then we have a couple of brief notes, including this note, paragraph 8, which I will come back to. We do not bid farewell to the Paschal meal with afikoman, word of uncertain origin and uncertain meaning, which I will come back to. And here are some more brief liturgical notes, or ritual notes. So here we are. So we have a meal. Back to my bullet points. Not clear exactly where it's supposed to be, but presumably you're eating the meal, and then hymns of praise and so on, and then it's done. Yes?
Why is it so certain that meal has to be a real meal and doesn't just refer to the symbolic foods that you eat?
Good question. Certainly when there was a real Paschal lamb, it would have been a real meal, which is to say roast lamb. I'm assuming that even in the absence of a real Paschal lamb, you would eat a real meal. Now, why am I 100% sure of that? 100% sure of that because that's what we do. But it's a good question. Maybe the Mishnah doesn't think you have a real meal. Is it possible the Mishnah assumes if you don't have a Paschal lamb, there's no real meal anymore? But then why are you saying grace after meals? See, that's the killer then. You have a grace after meals. Grace after meals is only after a meal. You don't say grace after meals after a snack. You're just eating some celery and parsley. That's not a grace after meals. So therefore, it's got to be a meal. All right? Mr. Mishnah could have been a little clearer exactly on how that's done. Other questions? Okay, now let's get to the big points. What time is it? Better hurry up. Mishnah has two key theological ideas. Vicarious experience, I already mentioned that. What does vicarious mean? Somebody else, right, from the Latin vica, right, from vicarious experience, right? That we are to imagine ourselves as if we ourselves have been gone through the exodus from Egypt. So it's transformative. Remember these things when we talk about the Eucharist next week. Okay, that's all I'm going to say at the moment. Hint. Okay. Redemption from Egypt prefigures our future redemption. While we are talking about the whole evening about the redemption of our ancestors from Egypt, slaves, Israelite slaves in Egypt, surely, clearly, what we are really talking about, or the subtext, or the intertext, is we're talking about us. That we not only imagine ourselves being redeemed from Egypt then, we imagine ourselves, of course, being redeemed now. That's very clear in these prayers here, this prayer of Rabbi Akiva, with a clear and unambiguous reference to the messianic redemption in the end of days when the temple will be rebuilt. And the Messiah will restore things. If you're not quite sure what a Messiah is, don't worry, we'll come to that in a few weeks. It's all oblique, but nonetheless unmistakable. So the Passover represents not just redemption past, but also redemption future. Namely, just as God redeemed our ancestors, so too God will redeem us. That's an implicit theme throughout. Here, Professor Cohen adds an interesting note. Passover as paradigm of redemption, analogous to Christian typology. Remember typology? Yeah, you say you do. Okay, good. Christian typology, right? So the same thing. Our Israelites were redeemed from Egypt. That represents a pattern of history. And that pattern of history can be reenacted. Just as in Christian thinking, Christ's life of Christ reenacts various moments from the Hebrew Bible, the scriptural stories of the Hebrew Bible. Similarly here, we Jews, by being redeemed, will also reenact the pattern story of the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, questions? David, you want to...
If past redemption is from slavery, what's
Right.
future redemption from?
It's from whatever existential condition that we currently have and we don't like. Maybe it's living under the Romans. Maybe it's a sense that God and His presence in the world is not as apparent as it should be. Maybe it's a sense of our own spiritual inadequacy. It could be whatever you think is the Egypt. That goes back to that mysterious phrase in the Mishnah. He commences with shame and concludes with praise. What's the shame? Namely, we're going from a status of we're unhappy to a status of praise. And God is redeeming us from shame and taking us to a situation where we praise the Lord. Now, that could be spiritual, that could be physical, that could be whatever. That's what we're doing in this evening. Shame, slavery in Egypt, to redemption. Okay, those of you briefly or do a Passover Seder will have noticed that I'll go through this quickly, that some of your favorite parts of the Seder aren't there in the Mishnah. How is this possible? What's wrong, Professor? Where is the dipping of the salt water, which every Hebrew school child knows? We have the salt water to remind us of the tears of the Israelites. Well, it's not there yet. Okay, how about the 4 sons passages? Nowadays, the 4 children passages. It's also not there yet. Yeah, you're right, it's not there yet. And how about the cup of Elijah? And how about songs at the end? Chad Gadya and Echad Miyodea. And how about, our Dayenu, our favorite Dayenu, our favorite song? Where is it? Answer, it's not there yet. The Mishnah is the beginning of the development of a Seder ritual. Not the end, it's the beginning. There's lots of things that are going to get added. In the traditional Jewish history of liturgy, nothing is ever taken away. Things are only added. Just gets longer, longer, and longer. Right? So wait another millennia, and you'll see things pop up. Okay, the interesting one here to pay attention to is the cup of Elijah. Elijah is the prophetic forerunner of the messianic deliverer, of the Messiah. So on Passover Eve, we hope that Elijah will be coming around to town. Elijah will return, and because that means Elijah is announcing the arrival of the Messiah, the arrival of the Messianic Redeemer. And of course, since I'm speaking Jewishly at the moment, I don't mean Jesus. I mean our Messiah, the real Messiah, speaking Jewishly. So that's the Elijah that we look forward to, again, emphasizing the fact that the whole festival is about redemption. Past, redemption, future. Okay, major historical question. Does the Mishnaic Seder predate 70 CE or not? When the Israelites, Jews, were gathering in the Second Temple times, and they actually had a Paschal lamb, and they actually gathered in the temple, slaughtered it, poured the blood out on the foot of the altar, roasted it, and then ate it by family units, all in and all around the precincts of Jerusalem. Did they have a Seder, or they just sit down to eat? Another way to phrase this question is, was the Last Supper of Jesus and His disciples a Paschal meal? Was it a Seder or not? So this is discussed at some length by Barr in the article I asked you, which is a little technical, I admit, but you can pay attention to the big point and don't get smothered in details. Right? Who's asking this question, and you see it's a real question. The answer is not clear. However, I have no doubt about this matter. I know it's not clear. Nonetheless, it's clear to me that there was no Seder pre-70 CE. Here I'm following the view of my late friend Baruch Boxer, who wrote a book called The Origins of the Seder. in which Baruch argues that this whole elaboration of Mishnah Psachim, this whole scripted meal, scripted text, scripted teaching, scripted instruction, all of that is to replace that which no longer is. And here's the paradox. In the Haggadah, in the Seder, pride of place is taken by the Paschal Lamb. But there is no Paschal Lamb. The Paschal Lamb is gone. The Romans saw to it that there is no more Paschal Lamb. The temple has been destroyed. So what do? We Jews do. We have a choice. We either can spend the 14th day, 15th day of Nisan at home doing nothing, or the creative geniuses of Rabbinic Judaism said, I know what we'll do. We'll do all this talking, all this scriptural, ritualized, scripted talk. We'll talk about the Paschal Lamb. We'll commemorate it. We'll remind ourselves of it. We'll talk around it. And that will take the place of the Paschal Lamb. So the whole Seder is actually designed to fill up the void caused by the destruction of the temple and the absence of the Paschal Lamb. If this is correct, and I'm sure my late friend Baruch Boxer got this right, then the Seder as we see it in Mishnah Psachim chapter 10, while it derives from various elements that came before, is fundamentally a rabbinic creation of the post-70 period. Which would mean that Jesus and his disciples are having a Paschal meal, they're eating a Paschal lamb, as I'll discuss next week, and there are some intimations there, what looks like a Passover Seder, sort of, but it's not really a Passover Seder because it doesn't have the key elements of question, answer, instruction, scriptural readings, scriptural exegesis. Because that's what makes the Seder a Seder. Okay, last 2 minutes, right on time. Mysterious Afi Cohen. Right, Mishnah Psachim has this mysterious line. We do not bid farewell to the Paschal meal with Afi Cohen. What does that mean? So in the Mishnah, this mysterious word, Afi Cohen, is something that we don't do. We don't bid farewell to the Paschal meal. We don't conclude the meal. We don't end the meal with Afi Cohen. And it's almost always translated with one of different terms in Greek, referring to after dinner entertainment or after dinner desserts, or bring on the dancing girls. We don't do that in the Paschal meal. We eat the Paschal meal and it's done. We eat the Passover lamb and it's done. That probably is what the Mishnah meant when it said we do not bid farewell to the Paschal meal with Afi Cohen, with the usual after dinner condiments, after dinner entertainment. Right? So the Paschal meal is the highlight of the evening. Period. No distractions. Presumably that's what the Mishnah meant with reference to the Paschal lamb itself. However, nowadays we use the word Afi Cohen in a very different sense. What does the word Afi Cohen mean nowadays? Or Afi Cohen is referring to a piece of matzah that we do eat. At the very beginning of the meal, we take a piece of matzah, break it, and then one part of that broken matzah is hidden away in an envelope or some zipper compartment or something, and is then hidden away. Lots of different customs here about the children hide it, and the father has to find it, or the father hides it, the children have to find it, whatever. It basically involves bribery. You give the kids a present at the end, or bribery. That's an ugly word. An incentive to stay awake, right? You give them a present, and at the end of the meal, we take out this piece of matzah and we eat it. That's the last thing we eat in the evening of the Seder, is this piece of matzah, this so-called Afi Cohen piece of matzah. In other words, the Afi Cohen has now become something that we do eat. The Mishnah says, don't conclude with Afi Cohen, ourselves of the Paschal lamb that our ancestors ate, and we no longer eat. We eat a meal, but we don't eat roast lamb. We eat this piece of matzah to remind us of the roast lamb that our ancestors used to eat. Now, this is all very intriguing. This is the first time we see the word Afi Cohen and this custom of reserving a piece of matzah for the end, calling it Afi Cohen, that appears for the first time in the 13th century. Okay? I mention that because there's some intriguing Christian parallel here. We have not yet figured out how to disentangle this. Because what is this piece of matzah, class? Piece of matzah is the symbol of the redemption, the Paschal Lamb, which is going to come at the end time, but is chosen away and hidden away at the beginning of time, the beginning of the meal, but it's hidden until it comes and is revealed at the end, bringing us the efflorescence of deliverance. So what is this piece of matzah, class? It's the Messiah, and we're eating it. There's something going on here. There's something going on. There's some Jewish Christian something going on here. And of course, it's all below the radar screen. There's no text that tells us this. No text will explain it. There's something funny going on here. The key point there is 13th century, not before. Okay, time's up. Thank you all. So next week we'll talk about the Christian side of the thing. We'll talk about Eucharist and Easter and how the scriptural texts turn into Christian rituals. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.